Okay, so you just saw the video of Professor Sorensen talking about the rise of towns and cities and their role in capitalism. And again, there are a lot of historians that look at the rise of towns and cities as sort of the prime mover in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, particularly in sort of the late feudal period where you get a crisis of feudalism. And of course, with the rise in towns and cities comes a greater intensification of merchant capital. There's larger markets for things to be sold. More commodities exist. There's a greater market for long-distance trade. And when I talked earlier about the wool trade, a lot of that putting out system, where merchants were financing the production of wool in sort of the putting out system, where they would send sort of the raw material to be turned into wool on sort of wool looms. A lot of that in England especially was for export to cities like Amsterdam, where it was used and traded further. So what we're going to look at now then is what comes next. Okay, you have this crisis of feudalism, but okay, how do you actually get a transition to capitalism? And this is where we put the focus back on the English countryside, right? All of these factors are important. Long distance trade is important. The demographics collapse is important. But a lot of what contributes to this shift from a sort of mode of production that we refer to as feudalism to the emergence of what would eventually become a sort of capitalism takes place in the English countryside. So how does this happen? Okay, so what you get eventually is the rise of what we can call commercial agriculture. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means in a moment. Now, the reason commercial agriculture doesn't exist in the way that we understand it under feudalism is, if you remember, feudalism, agriculture is produced as a surplus. Any sort of product that is produced goes to the lord, and then he controls basically all the agricultural surplus, which is partly why he has so much power. But it's not bought and sold in the same way that agriculture today is bought and sold as a commodity, right? There's very little cash actually trading hands between the lord and the peasants. It's certainly not with the serf. Usually what they get in exchange is the lord's protection and title to land. They may have part ownership of the land, but they're allowed to live with their family on a certain part of the land, provided that they farm that land for the lord. So there's very little cash that's actually taking place here. So if we go back and look at the size, a lot of what's being produced. So the question becomes, how do you then get a shift? How do you get a shift from that system? And it partly has to do with the demographic collapse that leads to this sort of class conflict between peasants and lord. And what starts to happen is the greater concentration of land. So amongst that conflict between peasants and lords that emerges out of sort of the demographic collapse brought on by the bubonic plague, where half of Europe's population, and certainly half of England's population, dies out, is all of a sudden, if 50% of the peasants are gone, then all of a sudden there's land that nobody's on. And somebody wants that land. So land, being sort of the key means of production under feudalism, there's desire to control it, right? So if you're a lord and you control a certain amount of land, you want more of it. Now, again, a lot of these lords didn't necessarily specifically own the land. They had title to it. They controlled the people on it. But what increasingly starts to happen after the Black Death is, because all of this land becomes available, lords start to consolidate and buy land directly, as do some free peasants as well. So what you get is a much greater concentration of land ownership in England. And eventually that leads to what we call the enclosure movement. Now, the enclosure movement sort of begins very early in capitalism, in many ways sort of the late feudal period. It intensifies under Tudor England, so beginning with Henry VIII and Elizabeth in the 1500s, the 16th century, and it really takes off in the late 17th century, especially after the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England, which you don't have to understand exactly what that is now. We'll talk more about that when we look at liberal democratic revolutions. But after 1688, what begins in many ways as sort of quasi-legality on the countryside, where lords are just sort of expropriating and taking over all this land, becomes legal in the late 17th century. And now the state does get involved in enclosure, again, under Tudor England, under the sort of the Tudor kings, beginning with Henry VIII. And you can see sort of an example. This is from England in the 18th century, so much later. But you can see how the enclosure movement actually works here. And here's another example. If we look at, again, this is 1836. So again, enclosure begins in the late sort of feudal period, the early period of capitalism. But it really extends all the way into even the 19th century. And now what enclosure meant was that you had common land that was available for peasants to use as pasture land or to farm. So it wasn't sort of private ownership in the same way that we think of land. And as you can see in this particular slide here, you don't see sort of tracts of land and fences and that kind of thing, right? It's sort of this common mass of land that people have grazing rights to. Now, if we look at the next slide, you can see after the enclosure happens, it looks completely different, right? You have tracts of land, you have ownership, you have various plots that are owned by individuals. So that's sort of what's happening at this point. Now, what that does is it concentrates land. And so all of a sudden, because the landowner starts to own a lot more land, the relationship between the landlord and the peasant changes. And largely because the peasants are paid on sort of fixed customary rates. This is not a market system initially under feudalism. So what they're paid or what they're owed in terms of the obligation between landlord and peasant is fixed in law, right? If an agricultural product becomes more scarce, they don't actually make more money because that's not how it works. It wasn't really functioning under supply and demand. It was functioning on sort of fixed customary rates. And so what that meant was the landlord then had an incentive to get rid of a various peasant because a lot of these customary rates were inherited. So if you were a peasant and had title to a specific land, you still had your obligation to produce agricultural surplus for the lord. But how much you produced was fixed in law and was passed down from generation to generation, right? So if the value of what you were producing went up, let's say there was a crop failure and all of a sudden there was less of something, well, under the laws of supply and demand, that would go up. So the landlord then still had to pay the peasant the same amount, whether it went up or down. So there was an incentive then to dispossess or kick peasants off the land and replace them with what's referred to as a tenant farmer. Now, a tenant farmer is somebody who rents the land, right? And the value of the agricultural crop was then determined by the laws of supply and demand. So what would happen then is if the lord was able to successfully get these peasants off the land, he would then sell the land to the highest bidder. So somebody who had a bit more money could pay a sort of market value for that land. And once they did it, they now had an incentive to create sort of efficiencies in production. I'm not talking about technology, but divisions of labor. Every year under feudalism, there was no incentive for the peasant to produce more or less crop. They just produced what they were produced, and the mutual obligations, they were given what they were owed, right? But if a peasant could become more efficient, right, could produce a higher yield with less work, with less labor, they could make more money. And they could then take that money and buy more land. Right? So land is becoming concentrated not just at sort of the lord level, but even peasants who were able to own some of their own land, concentrated land. They also started hiring wage labor. And because things became more efficient, less labor was required. So because of this transformation of property relations in the English countryside, it made agriculture in England a lot more productive. And as a result of that, less labor was required. Right? So instead of having 5 people doing a particular job, you may only need 1 or 2. Right? So what happens to those other 5 people? Well, what happens is they have nowhere to go. They don't own any land. And as a result of not owning any land, they can't live a subsistence lifestyle. They can't grow their own food because they don't own any land because everything's been enclosed. So if we think about this, this also leads to the expansion of cities because in creating a sort of landless population, well, there's not much for them to do on the countryside, so they then move into the cities, as Professor Sorensen explained earlier. And when they move into the cities and away from the countryside, it has 2 sort of things that happen. On the one hand, agriculture gets more efficient, land becomes commodified, agriculture becomes commodified, and labor becomes commodified. People that lack access to the means of production, which in this case is the land, the only way that they can live is to then sell their labor to a tenant farmer. Okay? And not only are they selling their labor, because they get paid in cash now, and they don't have access to land to produce their own food, to live a subsistence lifestyle, they have to buy food. They have to buy things that they would normally produce themselves. So what you've got is a creation of sort of a dual market for labor and commodities that labor produces. And many of these people, again, end up in the cities. So the cities start to expand and become much larger. And again, the expansion of cities leads to things like the intensification of handcraft production. It also leads to increasingly, and especially in England, a national market. Again, the English state was a more unified state a lot earlier than other parts of Europe. So as a result of this sort of expansion, you get the creation of a national market, which intensifies handcraft production, which creates a more efficient means of production and sort of the English countryside for the production of agriculture, but also creates a landless group of people who have nowhere to go and end up in cities. And it also then creates a market for handcraft production and agricultural products to sell to those people that end up in cities. Now, as those cities expand, what we'll get much later in the transition is now all of a sudden you have a mass of people that don't need to work in agriculture. So what this does is it means that handcraft production and manufacturing can eventually start to expand because you have all this labor that has nothing to do. Right? So employers then, merchants can then start to think, well, maybe I could start investing money in production because all this labor is not only available, but it's cheap because there's a lot of them, right? And not only that, anything that can be made, I can sell back to them because they can't produce anything. If they're producing anything, it is for a merchant at this point. Now, we'll talk more about that transition specifically next week. So even though, at least in the sort of early part of capitalism, you get this transformation of property relations on the English countryside, the rise of commercial agriculture, and an intensification of handcraft production, still, it's going to take a while for merchant capital to start to invest in production. Eventually it does, as I mentioned just previously, but still, trade is where the money is made. Industry is still underdeveloped, but all the potential is there for industry to expand. And by that potential, it means a growing market for commodities because people have less access to the land, a labor market of people. All of a sudden, you have thousands and eventually millions of people who would normally work in agriculture who now are available to do something else because agriculture has become more efficient. And so this is why we get this transition to capitalism. And again, historians can debate about what the prime mover was. Was it the collapse of the population as the result of the Black Death? Was it the class conflict that led to different relations of production? Was it the rise of cities? I think it's safe to say that all of these things contributed to the rise of capitalism. And again, historians can disagree on which was the most important, but you just want to understand the role of all of these things in precipitating this transition to capitalism. Okay, so that's mostly the lecture for today. Next week, we are going to look at, if we look at the slides here, we're going to look at the classic case continued, and we're going to take a much deeper look at the role of merchant capital. And the reading for next week is Alan Dully, Entrepreneurs, Class and Community, the Industrial Revolution in Lynn. Now, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Today, we sort of looked at what happened on the English countryside and how the emergence of capitalism was sort of a European-wide phenomenon. But we're going to skip ahead to, at least next week in our readings, to look at a case study of Lynn, Massachusetts. And this is sort of how the emergence of industrial production happens in the United States. Now, the prompts for next week's lecture, just to go over quickly here, are as such. So why were merchants and not others able to transform themselves into capitalists? How did the emergence of robust regional international markets stimulate capital development? Which features of the artisan mode of production form the most serious obstacles to capitalist reorganization of production? Okay, so these are things to think about when you do your readings for next week. All right, I will leave it at that.